Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us for this exhibition opening, Runaway Husbands, Desperate Families, the Story of the National Desertion Bureau. This is an exhibition that YIVO has created in collaboration with the Jewish Board. And we're really so pleased for tonight's panel discussion that the Tenement Museum has joined us in co-sponsoring this event. So for those that don't know YIVO, we're a very special place for the celebration and cultivation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an incredible library and archives with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, including the papers of the National Desertion Bureau, which is the topic of this exhibit and of this panel discussion. So I'm just going to introduce the speakers, and without further ado, we can get right into it. Eddie Portnoy is YIVO's Senior Academic Advisor and Director of Exhibitions. He is the author of Bad Rabbi and Other Strange But True Stories from the Yiddish Press, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2017, and he has published widely on Jewish popular culture. And Eddie is the curator of this exhibition, and he'll be leading the discussion tonight. Annie Polland is a public historian, author, and the president of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. She has previously served as the executive director here at the American Jewish Historical Society, and she's the co-author with Daniel Sawyer of Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, which was the winner of the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. And finally, Annette Igra is professor of history at Carleton College. Her academic interests include American women's history, social welfare history, labor history, and historiography. She is the author of Wives Without Husbands, Marriage, Desertion, and Welfare in New York. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panelists.
Okay, I have just a few words. Welcome, everyone. As you're already doubtlessly aware, we're here to celebrate the opening of our new exhibit, Runaway Husbands, Desperate Families, the Story of the National Desertion Bureau. What you don't know that the original title of the exhibit was This You Call a Husband? The Story of the National Desertion Bureau. We decided not to go with that. Not sure why. We, meaning YIVO, did this together with the Jewish Board, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. And this was an exhibit topic that I've wanted to do for a long time, and so I'm pleased that the Jewish Board's anniversary prompted us to do so, and I'd like to thank them for all of their help, and especially Gavin Beinert-Smollett, who did quite a lot of work. Very briefly, the National Desertion Bureau is, or was, a Jewish organization that most Jews have never heard of, possibly because it dealt with an issue that was potentially embarrassing to the community. During the early 20th century, it became apparent that family abandonment had reached epidemic proportions in the Jewish immigrant community and warranted a communal response in order to find the men who had deserted their wives and children and force them to pay alimony, child support, or to provide divorces if desired. Working from 1911 through the 1960s, the National Desertion Bureau tracked tens of thousands of men, not all of them Jewish, but most of them. In fact, family desertion wasn't a specifically Jewish problem at all. It affected all immigrant communities, as well as American-born citizens suffering from poverty. But in its Jewish incarnation, communal leaders felt that the issue of deserters and the possibility of Jewish women and family on government roles could generate anti-Semitism, so they decided to handle it as a social issue that affected their specific community. And so in 1911, the United Hebrew Charities, the precursor to the Jewish Board, created the National Desertion Bureau in order to track deserters and bring them to justice. The exhibit that opens tonight, and which you will hopefully see after our panel, describes the origin and work of the National Desertion Bureau and features a number of never-before-seen documents, photographs, and ephemera from their voluminous archives, which are now housed by YIVO. So now, let me join this panel. Sorry, going to switch mics. I'm going to start with Annie, who as president of the Tenement Museum, has certain awareness of the issues involved. I want you to set the stage for us. What are the basic parameters of the mass Jewish emigration to North America that began in the 1880s? What do people need to know?
Sure. I just want to note that my husband is at home. He's not deserting me. He's at home right now.
You think?
Well, that's true. Maybe this was all, set up so that I'd be out for the evening. So approximately 2 to 2.5 million East European Jews leave Russia, Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Romania, and the vast majority come to the United States, and the vast majority of them come through New York, and the vast majority of that group settles on the Lower East Side. And so the Jews are fleeing economic dislocation. There's overpopulation in the Pale of Settlement where they're restricted to live, and so they're coming for a chance to live. They're coming for economic opportunity. We're going to talk tonight a lot about families from the point of view of someone trying to, support a family. It became extremely difficult to live there, and therefore this migration occurred. There were also pogroms, attacks on Jewish life and property, which added more incentive to leave. And so why the United States? Why New York? The United States offered economic opportunity, and also the United States let them in, so that also helps. And so they settled in large numbers in New York City because a lot of them actually didn't come with money to go further than New York. And so then also New York had opportunity because of the garment industry where many of them found work. And so the basic parameters were that, people came over in large numbers in a pretty short amount of time. What was happening in the United States is that there was rapid immigration in general, and urbanization and industrialization. So they were leaving a place and then coming to a place that was also undergoing a lot of change. And then once on the Lower East Side, for example, the kind of the common denominator, whether you were from a small town in the Pale of Settlement or a larger town, for the most part, you're going to live in a tenement. And so the tenement became almost like the kind of the common landscape for all of these people coming from different places.
Thanks. So Annette, during the late 19th century, prior to the existence of the National Desertion Bureau, what was the nature of Jewish self-help and charitable organizations, and how and why did the issue of family desertions arise?
Well, there were many different organizations. There were Landsmannschaften organizations, like hometown organizations. There were women's organizations. There were organizations dedicated to the support of widows in particular. Okay, sorry, I'm not used to using mic. Dedicated to the support of widows. There were burial societies. There was a whole landscape. And the United Hebrew Charities was founded in 1874. And that aggregated half a dozen about of these organizations into one society, to one umbrella society. And they did have desertion cases among their cases. And unlike many of the Protestant charities that did not assist deserted women on the theory that if they assisted deserted women, men would be encouraged to leave their wives, right? So they didn't. Jewish charities generally did. They were more generous.
And just to add to that, it comes from the records here, the United Hebrew Charities records are here, and so we, at the Tenement Museum, one of the stories we tell the stories of people who lived in our building, and one was that of Natalie Gumpertz, whose husband, Julius Gumpertz, one day in October of 1874, left the household, went to work, and did not return. And, there was a search party for him, all of it. But we found that the United Hebrew Charities helped Natalie Gumpertz, yes. Who then opened up a dressmaking shop. So I think it's such an important point because a lot of people think this began with the East European Jews, but it was prominent also with the Central European Jews as well.
Yeah, desertion was a concern not just of Jews and not just of the late 19th century. If you look at 18th century newspapers or 19th century American newspapers, you see notices, some of them from men who's tracking down their wives, because at the time men were responsible for their wives' debts, and they wanted to say they weren't responsible. So there are ads for both men and women who disappeared in American newspapers.
Right, so this is for both of you. If possible, what was it about tenement life, that made things possibly more difficult? What did the immigrants encounter in that kind of environment that may have prompted family dissolution?
How long do I have? I mean, look, a tenement most people were living in spaces that were about 325 square feet, about half the size of a subway car. You could have a family of 6, 7, or 8 people sharing 3 pretty small rooms. Sometimes those rooms also functioned as workspaces. People made clothes. There were garment shops in those very rooms. So the crowdedness, I think it's really difficult for us to even comprehend how crowded it was. And then, of course, there were diseases. Bathrooms were outside until 1905, and then they were inside. There was no running water until 1905 in many of the tenements. So sickness, disease, crowdedness, I don't think you would have any opportunity for privacy. And so again, if you're a lot of the times we blame the men who ran off, and I'm not excusing them. However, I mean, just think if you worked 12 hours a day at a shop and then you came home and your home was just, 6 children and a wife and maybe a boarder. I mean, just the crowdedness and the tension and the anxiety. There was always work happening in the tenements as well. So, and the Jewish family had enormous pressure on it because the Jews came in large numbers and they came to stay. That was one thing that differentiated Jewish immigrants from Italian immigrants or Greek immigrants or others coming at the time. They knew they were going to stay. So because they knew they were going to stay, they brought their wives with them faster. They brought their children with them faster. Now, assuming you like your family, that's still hard. But what it means is I think it's like each Jewish man was responsible for supporting 1.8 people, as opposed to in the non-Jewish immigrants it was 1.3. So there were more children, more wives, more people who weren't bringing money in, all crowded into these tenements, and the strain. And then if the number one job is the garment industry, and the garment industry is seasonal, and you're out of job, I mean, there was this constant need to rearrange the family economy. And so the pressure on the Jewish family was especially intense.
Right. Wow. So clearly, we learned that life was extremely difficult for this particular immigrant group, and they had this issue of family abandonment. So, Annette, can you describe for us the origins of the National Desertion Bureau? Why this needed to be created? Who ran it? Who funded it? And how it functioned?
Oh, those are big questions. Well, it was actually grew out of some committees in the National Conference of Jewish Charities that pre-existed the Desertion Bureau, the first starting around 1900. And between 1900 and 1911, these committees got more and more formalized until finally some wealthy donors contribute to the formation of this National Desertion Bureau, which was meant to serve the Jewish charities around the country. And it had lawyers working for it, social workers. They had investigators, people who would stake out haunts that they heard that the men were seen at, and investigate whether the men were there. So they had, their wealthy donors tended to be immigrants from earlier in the 19th century, from that immigration. But the actual lawyers and social workers were often Eastern European Jews who were, who kind of made it a bit better than the immigrant Jews. They'd gone to law school when going to law school was not easy for Jews. So they were kind of in between. They tended to speak Yiddish. So it was not simply a kind of wealthy and poor relationship. There were these intermediary figures.
And so, when they started, how did people know to, go there? And
well, most people didn't go there on their own. They knew about it because it was advertised in the Forverts, right? It was advertised in the press. So people knew about it that way. But most people were sent there because they reached some kind of economic emergency where they needed help. And they went to a charity, usually the Jewish charities, but eventually when New York State set up the mother's pensions, which is like mother's allowances, it preceded AFDC. And eventually when they went for AFDC and so on, those agencies would send the deserted woman to the Desertion Bureau. And they would say, you can't get assistance unless you cooperate in searching for your husband. So most women ended up there through referrals. And I think in the vitrines, there's some referral letters. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, and just so everyone knows, definitely go upstairs and look at the exhibit, because one of the best parts is this section from the Jewish Daily Forward, the most popular of the Yiddish newspapers, a socialist newspaper, which had a 250,000 circulation by World War I, something like that, and 1 million readers by. But so they got so many letters to the Forward saying, I can't find my husband, or my husband left, that they started printing the pictures. So all these men had thought, I'll leave. I'll go to Cincinnati. I'll go to Harlem. I'll leave wherever I am and go somewhere else. But because everyone read the Forverts, then you'd see the picture in the paper. And so it was a picture in the paper plus the description of Benjamin Rosenblum, who left his wife Minnie with 3 children, and this paragraph about it. I mean, that was a big deal for the newspaper to print all of this. And it shows how even before, and these were people who were just turning to the newspaper for help. They didn't know about the charities to help necessarily, but they were going to the newspaper because the newspaper was viewed as an agency of help.
And I could just point out that the Gallery of Missing Husbands, or the Galerie von Verschwundene Männer, this column in the Forwards, was extremely popular. And on the one hand, other newspapers accused the Forward of using it as a form of sensationalism in order to draw readers. And the reality was that, people would turn to that column to look for pictures of their neighbors, and there was a kind of element of schadenfreude to find, when you found someone you knew in the Gallery of Missing Husbands. And one interesting thing that I discovered when going through the files when I was creating the exhibit is that I found a number of letters in different files, anonymous letters, that were either written to the Forward or to the National Desertion Bureau that said, Melvin Berkowitz, I saw his picture in the paper. He works at such and such, hat maker shop on Delancey Street. He works the afternoon shift. You can find him there, and it would be signed "An Interested Party." So there was this phenomenon of kind of like neighborhood finks who understood that, the women who had been deserted, needed help and, needed their husbands to support them. And so you wind up with people, chiming in, as a result of finding these pictures in the paper. But one of the things I wanted to ask is, when a man deserted, obviously it has great effect on the family and the women. So what did you find?
Well, we have to remember that most Jewish men did not earn enough to support families. So this idea of the man as the support of the family was not the case. I mean, the estimates are that they earned about 20 to 30% of a Jewish family's income. So you have to think about these families as made up of multiple earners, often sons and daughters, typically, who would start to work around the age of 14 if they weren't just helping at home with homework. So when they left, often women just tried to make ends meet for as long as they could. So I found that less than 10% of women would end up at the Desertion Bureau via a charity within a month of their husband leaving. And most of them took more than 6 months, and something like 40%, it was more than a year after he left. So what happened was they made ends meet somehow, and then there was some kind of emergency. Either they were working and they got ill, one of their kids was working and the kid got ill, they were on the verge of eviction, They might have an elderly parent that they now had to take care of, and they would go to the charity and say, I need help, I can't make it anymore. And the charities would say, well, why don't you go to the National Desertion Bureau, they'll find your husband, and he'll help.
Right, and so one of the things I wanted to ask about was, the role of orphanages. Like, at what point does a family reach when they decide that a child has to go to an orphanage? And there were enormous Jewish orphanages. There was one where City College is now uptown. There was one in Brooklyn. There was one in Harlem. At what point, does the family reach when that takes place?
Well, most of the children in the orphan asylum had a parent who was living. It was just that they couldn't afford to take care of them. So I think that might be a point where someone might go to the National Desertion Bureau or go to one of these organizations to find the husband at that point before they have to let the kids go into the orphan asylum. Or others might put them in the orphan asylum so that they're able to work. I mean, it was individual and choice by choice, but I don't know the overall.
Yeah, I found quite a few women who approached Jewish agencies and then ended up at the Desertion Bureau when they tried to place their children in an orphanage or some kind of care, institutional care, because they needed to work or because they couldn't support their child and they were unemployed and they were looking for a job. And I think that the Desertion Bureau and Jewish charities were very ambivalent about this. On the one hand, they did encourage Jewish charities, they're not unique in this, did encourage women to be as self-sufficient as they could be and not to take charity. On the other hand, they were very ambivalent about women who were too eager to drop their children off. So I did have one story of a woman who was a waitress, I think at a resort, and she said, the guests are complaining about my child. Will you please take this child off my hands so that I can keep this really well-paying job, which for a Jewish woman was a well-paying job. And they noted she seems too eager to place her child. So on the one hand, yes, they wanted women to work and they wanted to help them by, they would place out the children, but sometimes they thought that was a little unseemly for a woman to be too eager to do that.
And it could go the other way too, right? They could say if a woman didn't want to work, if a woman wanted to stay home with her kids, they might say, oh, well, why isn't she going out to work and help support the household?
Then she's lazy, yes.
Right. I mean, this falls, some of this falls in the categories of one of the great parts of the exhibit is the charts created by Gavin of all the reasons why, men and sometimes occasionally women would abandon the families, but there's like a myriad reasons, ranging from, too lazy, didn't do laundry, there was one didn't like Baltimore. I mean, it's really fascinating, all of these reasons. So I'm wondering when you were going through the files, like what kind of details did you find that that sort of stood out for you?
Well, one of the categories that's very large on the chart that was also something commented on by National Desertion Bureau workers was that the other women category. Because when they compared it with their non-Jewish statistics of non-Jewish charities, they found that more Jewish men, so reason for desertion was other women than non-Jewish men. And they went into a panic because they were concerned that this would imply that Jews are less moral than other people. and they kept finding ways to deny that this was the case. So that was a very big one, was other women. And some of these men did actually find other women who supported them. One of the great stories in my book is about a man who writes to his wife very vengefully, and I don't think he's telling the truth, but he says, I'm with my new girlfriend, and she and I are going out and buying a lot of things, and she is paying, and I'm dressed in diamonds and jewelry, and I'm so glad I'm far away from you. And that's what he wrote to his wife. Now, I don't know if this other woman was really supporting him. we don't know. The Desertion Bureau didn't think that was the case in most cases. They commented during the Depression, when, of course, desertion was an issue nationally. People were worried that men who were unemployed would leave their families. Charles Zunzer, who was the head of the Desertion Bureau, commented that he didn't see any rise in Jewish desertions during the Depression, that it was the same kind of flow that he'd had. And he said the reason is other women are expensive. This is a quote, "In hard times, the old wife will have to do."
So one of the interesting things here is the comparative aspect. You know, Annie talked about, you know, Italian immigrants versus Jewish immigrants. So, you know, it's clear that this isn't just a Jewish issue. You know, all men do this, no matter who they are, where they came from. But, you know, you mentioned just now the non-Jewish organizations that, you know, helped, you know, women. You know, what were these organizations, and were there policies, and, you know, how did they address it in the same way or in different ways? What are the differences and similarities in how they dealt with the situation?
Well, I think I mentioned that Protestant charities were very reluctant to help deserted women monetarily, and because they felt it would lead to this is one of the categories on the chart, collusive desertions, in which a man and a woman would collude to make it look like he had left so that they could get charity. And so this kind of what we would today call welfare fraud was something that Protestant charities were very concerned about, and so they generally did not help deserted women with money, right? They were very reluctant to do it, and that was similar with New York State. When New York State developed a program for single mothers to get funds, they initially did not include deserted women in that. So it was like widows could get monthly allowances, but not deserted women. And then when they finally admitted deserted women in 1924, they said they had to have proof, an affidavit showing that they had been looking diligently for their husbands, and their husbands had not been spotted, even located, spotted, seen for 5 years. So essentially that they were dead to them. So there was a very kind of stingy way of other organizations dealing with them. Whereas Jewish organizations tended right away, even in the 1890s, were giving these kinds of monthly pensions to some deserted women.
What, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, can you tell them about Dina Goldfarb and the story that's up in the exhibit? Because I think that's a great...
Oh, sure. Lena. Right, so this is, Annie's asking me to tell, I can give you a brief synopsis of one of the cases, National Desertion Bureau cases that's featured in the exhibit. It's the case of Lena and Nathan Goldfarb. Nathan Goldfarb was a watchmaker. He lived with his wife Lena on East 98th Street. And they had an extra room in their apartment that they rented to a boarder by the name of Minnie Schechter. Nathan had an affair with Minnie Schechter, and Lena caught them in the act, after which Nathan and Minnie disappeared. Lena went to the National Desertion Bureau. She filled out an application. She gave them all the information that she had about Nathan, including photographs and names of family members and work colleagues and friends. The National Desertion Bureau was able to track Nathan and Minnie to San Francisco, where they had an attorney who worked with them, and this attorney managed to track Nathan and Lena to Alameda, California, which is sort of a suburb of San Francisco, where they were found living in the fruit shop of one Solomon Garfinkel. And all three of them were involved in a free love commune. This was 1911, by the way. So what ends up happening is that Minnie falls in love with Solomon Garfinkel, the fruit shop owner. They get married. This upsets Nathan a great deal, and they move out, they move to a house. Nathan begins going to the house and harassing them. He harasses them so much that they move out of Alameda to San Francisco. They contact the National Desertion Bureau associate in San Francisco and tell him that Nathan's been harassing them, but if he threatens him with prosecution, he'll probably go back to New York and reconcile with his wife, which is what they did and what he did. And the story ends in, I believe, 1914 with Nathan reconciling with his wife.
And they lived happily ever after.
Well, yeah. So I can't say for sure that they lived happily ever after. But that's the resolution that you find in the files of the National Desertion Bureau. And one of the aspects that I found in these files is that these sort of very rich stories of immigrant life that you really don't find anywhere else. So it's really quite amazing to go through them and discover these, sort of little, dramas that take place in the lives of these people, all documented in a really very serious way by the Bureau.
And one other piece of that I love is that Lena Goldfarb became a restaurant owner. She opened up a little restaurant on Stanton Street. So just giving an example of women and work and the kinds of jobs women could do to support themselves. And running a restaurant was something that a lot of widows did as well. It was just it's important to understand that women worked a lot in these households. If you look at census records, often it will say housewife or something. It won't say the job they did, but they were running even when their husbands were there, they had boarders, and they were collecting money from the boarders to make ends meet. If the husband ran a shop, it was the woman also running the shop alongside or running the push cart. So women were real kind of economic actors in all of this, but they were this piece, and so if the husband ran off, it made the rest of it untenable often, which is why the charities had to come in. But I just love that story, sorry.
Right. No, it's a good story. So I just want to point out that, this aspect that Annie is talking about, that, women did this kind of work, this is all the result of a piece of ephemera that's in the Goldfarb file. It's a business card of Lena Goldfarb's private restaurant on Stanton Street. It's a Yiddish business card, and it's very likely that she started this restaurant after she was abandoned in order to make ends meet. And it was essentially it was a non-licensed or really illegal restaurant. She would put out small advertisements, business cards. It was a kosher restaurant, cheaper than a regular restaurant where workers could go and eat lunch or dinner, and she could earn some sort of living off of that. So it's a really kind of interesting aspect of life that you don't find documented very often in history texts.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that it's absolutely true that women were bringing in income into the household and children, particularly children. Often one of the emergencies that happened for women was the loss of their job, or the loss of a job of a child, or the marriage of a child. So often a daughter's marriage would create a crisis in the family budget, because a daughter would then go off and join another family and withdraw her from work and from supporting the family, her family of origin. Also, many women did work in the small businesses that are when a man is a shopkeeper, which I think a quarter to a third of Jewish immigrant men were already in the early period, and it only increased. Usually their wives were also working in the shop, and I found a number of files in which a man deserted who had run a shop, and the wife said, I think he owes it to me. All those years I worked for him, and he never paid me. He owes me some money. And so it was, when the census taker came, she may have been noted down as not working, as not employed, but she understood that she was making the money too. Yeah.
Right. Wow, interesting. So, Annette, I want to take you see if you'll go back a number of years and describe to us, one, how you fell into this topic, and two, how you did the research. And I know there's some interesting details, as concerning that. So please talk to us.
Okay. I came to this not because I wanted to write about the Desertion Bureau, because I wanted to write about Jewish history. I came to it because I was interested in issues of how gender and the state were mutually constituted. And I was particularly, it seemed to me marriage and welfare were two areas that would be fruitful. So I spent a lot of time looking for the family court records of New York. And finally, I went and spoke, and to get permission to use them, I spoke to the clerk of the family court, and he said to me, "Oh, I don't think they exist, but good luck if you find any. We're burning the 1950s right now." So that didn't seem promising, but I had done a different project on Jewish protests against high prices in 1917, where I had been at YIVO and I saw the National Desertion Bureau records. So I went and I found them. I found that they had them, but most of them were in New Jersey, but about 17,000 were in file cabinets in the sub-basement of the 86th Street building of YIVO, which means the basement below the basement, okay? And they were in file cabinets, many of which were rusted shut, and because the janitor at that building was afraid of going into the sub-basement, he was convinced that there was asbestos there, he didn't actually take things down there, he threw boxes down the steps. So I had to make my way through boxes of old Jewish summer camp ephemera to get to the file cabinets. But before I did that, I had to go to the Jewish board to request permission. And that took, getting that permission, legal permission to use the files, took about 7 months. And in the end, I got permission to use them, but I had to change all the names. All the names in my book are made up. The file numbers are correct, so you can verify my research by going to the file number. The irony of it was that the National Desertion Bureau regularly fed the Gallery of Missing Men in the Forverts. So these names were well known in the community, but I had to keep them private. So my book does not have any real names of clients in there. I had to make them up and make sure I wasn't actually using a name that was in the file, because there are a lot of common names in there. And then when I went down, finally, YIVO would only allow me to take one file at a time. So I would go into the sub-basement. I had a random number system of getting a sample, okay, what's called a stratified sample. So I'd go down, open the file cabinets, find the number, pull out the file. I would get covered in dirt. The files are dirty, they're gritty. And then I would go up to the main floor of YIVO, wash off my arms, and then go up a couple more floors to the reading room, read that file, and then return it and do it. And I was only allowed to take one file at a time. So I used, in my book there are 300 case files, although I looked at more. So I did this at least 300 times, up and down about 5 flights of stairs.
Didn't you find a bar of soap in the file cabinet?
Yes, and I did find a desiccated bar of soap in the file cabinets, and I thought, this is perfect. They knew I was going to have to wash up after doing this. So that's how I did it. And then, I use stories from it, but because there are no administrative records, you don't really know about the Desertion Bureau itself or the agency. You have to work through the case files to find out how it's functioning. So you have to read a lot of them to figure out the structure of the Desertion Bureau, how it operates. But it shows you how it's interconnected with the larger welfare system in New York, as well as the larger legal system, including the domestic relations court system, which gets set up around the same time as the Desertion Bureau.
Wow, so, you could see the dedication that was required to do this research. I can also attest to the fact that these files are dirty. Every time I went through these files, I would have to wash my hands. In fact, at some point I started, thinking, should I wear rubber gloves? Because they're just covered with dirt. I don't know if you have any more questions, we can get to them, or we can take questions from the audience. If people are interested, is there anything else you'd like to say, or?
I did want to answer a question that I think you got when you were taking the tour. I overheard a little bit that I can answer, sure. Which someone asked about domestic violence. Domestic violence. And I did find domestic violence in a lot of the families that show up there, although that was not necessarily the reason why they were at the Desertion Bureau. Some of them were there because of domestic violence. So there were some women who would come to the Desertion Bureau and say, make my husband behave, for example, because they understood the Desertion Bureau as being an agency that was on the side of women in their struggles with their husbands. And I think that's why they went there. There was no such thing as a battered women's shelter. The domestic relations courts themselves did not issue orders of protection. Those domestic violence cases remained in the regular criminal courts. So they did sometimes go, and sometimes they wanted to arrange separate support. And it was really the Desertion Bureau lawyers were very active in changing what became the family court in 1933, its jurisdiction, to make it so that it had the jurisdiction to issue orders of protection for battered wives, which it did not before. So they were instrumental in getting its jurisdiction, even though the court rarely actually issued any of these, from what I found. It did expand the jurisdiction and the recognition of domestic violence. So that was a contribution they made.
Talk? Hello. I just wonder, is there find figures of how successful they were? Is there a track record how successful they were in tracking down these people?
They were very successful in locating men. They were unsuccessful in getting them to support their families. So I'll give you some statistics, okay? They located men in about a little more than 75% of the cases, which is amazing. They found the men. But, and this is based partly on domestic relations court statistics, only about 3% of the men under a support order ever paid. So, in other words, they were very successful in finding men. Getting men to support their families, nobody was, the court system wasn't successful, right? And, you know, it kind of flies in the face of the assumption that wage earning for husbands means the families are supported, which is what the welfare system was trying to use marriage as a way to take care of women's and children's poverty. But it's a demonstration that marriage is not, as Dan Quayle famously said, marriage is the best solution to poverty, right? The best anti-poverty program. It's not really. So.
Do you know how many of, like, did some of the, I would imagine that some of the women would have just preferred getting money and not reuniting with their husbands?
Reconciliations were very rare. I remember one woman who really wanted her husband back, and it was a case where the husband left because he was ashamed that he was unemployed. And she said, tell him to come back. I won't blame him. It's okay. I'd rather have him at home. And so wives were pretty understanding about unemployment. They often didn't want their husband. These were often mutual separations. They didn't get along. They wanted to separate. Divorce was hard to get in New York. It was very expensive to get in New York. The Desertion Bureau had a policy of not representing women in divorces in the Supreme Court. They did break that policy sometimes. Often there were a lot of times when women didn't want the men back, but they were being, in a way, taught a lesson, which is your first go-to when you're in economic trouble should be a husband, right?
Right. I just want to add that, you said that they were able to find 75% of the men, which is really astounding because this was done entirely by way of mail. And, sometimes it took weeks, but I found, in one of the files, a woman would come in, an application form would be filled out, and she would provide a photograph, and the photograph would be copied and sent out to the Forverts and various other newspapers, and also to their affiliates, wherever they thought that, the men might be. And I found one case where, I think it may have been somewhere in Los Angeles, but they sent a photograph and a description to their affiliate in Los Angeles, who, sent out investigators, and one of whom said, "Oh yes, I saw this man riding a bicycle down such and such a street," and it was almost by happenstance, but they were really able to find a lot of them, and to a certain degree, the National Desertion Bureau was a detective agency. And, as a result, the stories of finding the men are really, really fascinating. The fact that they couldn't get them to pay is kind of another matter. But it's the story, the stories themselves are really incredible.
So my question is, so what happens are the women allowed to remarry? Are they agunot? Do they get a get? What happens to their status with these deserted?
In some cases, they are able to get a get. Sometimes they can't. In New York State, they could get a separation of bed and board. Absolute divorce was hard to get in New York. So generally, this is true of working class people in American history generally, not just Jews, that the formal divorces, even formal marriages, are not necessarily what they do. And especially divorces in New York were expensive. And that's why desertion is called the poor man's divorce. That's why bigamy was so common in these cases, because people didn't get formal divorces. They just moved on to another relationship. So they were separated, often not legally separated, but essentially.
Religiously, they would not be able to remarry unless they had.
Right. And occasionally, I remember some cases in which a woman was specifically wanted to remarry, and she didn't have a get, and she would ask the Desertion Bureau to find her husband, not to get support, but because she was going to marry someone for whom that mattered. So that did occasionally happen, yes.
Here, hold on.
You didn't really need a get if you married a non-Jew. Having said that, however, the point I wish to make and then ask my question is, it seems in the old countries, there was a much stronger, more cohesive Jewish community that had certain safeguards and prevented men from deserting their families because it became a shanda. Once they came to this country, it became really a free-for-all. It seemed that there was a lot of freedom and not just pressure. In your research, I'm interested about the gigolos. How many men actually had girlfriends on the side, and how many had actual second families living in two different towns or two different cities and would tell their wives, well, I have a job that requires me to travel?
Generally, I found the second family or girlfriend or mistress, the other woman category much more than the gigolo category. But and some of these men, like there's one man that I quote who was actually really wanted to support his family. He had really internalized this breadwinner ideal, and he had a second family, and he was a bigamist, right? He never got a divorce. And he wrote to the Desertion Bureau and said, I really would like to support my first wife, or really technically his legal wife, but I have the second family to support. And the way he put it is, I'm between the devil and the deep blue sea, the devil being the first wife, the deep blue sea being the second wife, and children. And, the idea, so he even was not leaving his wife in order to have like a younger or a wealthier or a woman who had a better job. He really sincerely had internalized this idea that he should support his family. But he just couldn't do it. He couldn't support two. So I think that I didn't find that many gigolos in the sense, or if you mean someone who had lots of wives simultaneously, it was serial. It's serially. One of the things in terms of the get, there was what was called the get evil in the United States that was discussed quite a lot, and it wasn't so much the inability to have a man give a get. It was that men would send their wives gets that were not technically kosher gets. So they're, they would get them from someone who was making money on the side by, basically selling gets. So.
And I was just going to add to the point about how the family and the community functioned in Eastern Europe before migration. You're absolutely right that there were more communal structures in place. However, in Eastern Europe, there was a lot of modernization and change happening as well, and the family was also under assault, and there were also cases like this there too. Although, again, with all of this, these are stories that don't get passed down in the family lore necessarily, right? So, we could, my great-grandmother, I don't know, could she have had another husband and he deserted? Maybe that wouldn't have been passed down. So it's so interesting to kind of think about, there's a way in which we romanticize sometimes what had happened in the past, and just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, the Jewish press in Eastern Europe ran stories, that were, scandalous, and for all the reasons that Eddie said, people like to read the gallery about desertion in the Eastern European Jewish press, both Hebrew and Yiddish. And, in part this is because there were transformations going on in Eastern Europe that affected gender relations. And this was these kinds of stories were ways in which Eastern European Jews were working out questions of gender and questions of what men and women owed to each other. And this was already going on in Eastern Europe. So it did exist before. And I think, but the way you phrased it was really interesting to me, because you said, oh, they have all this freedom here. And what struck me was that the people who worked at the Desertion Bureau and anti-desertion reformers generally saw desertion as men seeking freedom. And I thought, oh, they're kind of ambivalent about marriage too. If being married, if running away from your wife is freedom, what is being married and staying with her? So there was a lot of ambivalence on the part of men about marriage, and particularly the kind of male breadwinner form of marriage that these organizations were trying to inculcate in immigrant Jews.
And even if someone doesn't desert, right, there still are all of these gender tensions working out. That it's, on the one hand, it's migration and what that does, but what's also going to happen as the decades go on, as there's movement into the middle class and you move from working class to middle class, that causes its own tensions with regard to kind of gender that would also work their way out.
Wouldn't there also be men deserting because they were forced into a marriage?
I looked at the marriages, if maybe, but I think I looked at the marriages of the clients of the Desertion Bureau and where they got married, okay? And more than 80%, slightly more than 80%, were married in the United States. In other words, they met each other here. They were mostly immigrants, but they were not marriages in which the man came separately from a wife. 80% of them, a little more, met each other in the United States. They were living in the United States. They met each other. They got married. So this is another story that I think is very powerful in the Jewish community, is this idea that what desertion was a man coming over first, his wife either abandoning his wife or his wife coming over later, and there being some kind of cultural lag where he Americanizes and she's still, but that's not actually what the Desertion Bureau saw. They recognized very early that this was not the kind of case that made up the majority of their cases. There were files that dealt with those, but they were the smallest number of files out of all the files, including around the United States. About 2/3 of the men that they found in New York and vicinity. And about a little less than 1/3 they found in places like Los Angeles, Montreal. They also had connections to Canada.
I just want to say that for those interested in stories of Jews misbehaving in Eastern Europe, I highly recommend Eddie Portnoy's book, Bad Rabbi, which is amazing stories pulled from the Yiddish press, much of which is in Eastern Europe, some of which is here in New York as well.
And it includes a story of a fortune teller who could, on the Lower East Side, who could tell women where their missing husbands were. if they pay them.
Right, you can find him in the exhibit. His name's Professor Abraham Hochman. He's a professional psychic who's active on the Lower East Side. He's a very well-known figure there. And one of his specialties is to locate the missing husbands of mostly Jewish women on the Lower East Side. And it was known that typically every morning, women would line up at his stoop, waiting to find out about his, waiting to find out whether or not he could find their missing husbands. And as it happens, the Jewish board has a member who's related to Professor Hochman. I don't know if you want to identify yourself or not, but you don't have to.
We're the two great-granddaughters of Abraham.
Did he pass on his abilities? Are you psychic?
Is my husband still home?
We've got a large audience watching on Zoom right now, and we've got a lot of questions from them. I just want to ask one of them before continuing with this audience here. Women who deserted their husbands were mentioned in passing. Was this a phenomenon that you found in your research? Is this something to speak of at all?
Well, there were women who wanted to leave their husbands because of domestic violence, but I did have one case in which a woman went to the Desertion Bureau and said, I'm leaving my husband. Please, I'm telling you so that you will not consider me a deserter, and advertise this. So she thought she could be considered a deserter if she left her husband because he was beating her. So that's the only one I found. But I should say that the laws that tried to enforce, not very successfully, men-supported families also allowed for a wife to be sued for support, to be charges against her, to be brought to support her husband. And I did have one case in the domestic relations court in which the man was represented by the Desertion Bureau, and the woman was being ordered to support her husband. Because the way the family law of the poor worked was to try to get anyone in the family to support anyone else. So it applied to grandparents and grandchildren, husbands and wives, children and parents, as a way to prevent them from placing demands on the public purse, becoming dependent on the public purse. So rather than redistributing economically taxpayer funds, instead they tried to contain poverty in the family by finding someone in the family who they could order to support whoever the poor relative was.
So when you say they found a lot of people and very few of them paid, was that you can't get blood from a stone, that there were no assets, or were the legal tools not available to try to, I don't know, garnish wages, or why was there no money?
The legal tools for garnishing wages have been increased over time, and there's now a federal system for this. It's still, most of the time, it's not successful. It's a little bit more successful, but it still isn't. Part of it is that deserters didn't desert once and get found. They deserted multiple times. So, he'd pay 1 week and leave. But from many charities and with the welfare system's perspective, they often dropped a woman from their roles if there was an order of support, right? They would assume that the support was being picked up, and it wasn't. Sometimes they couldn't make enough money, sometimes they couldn't, but often judges were very sympathetic to men who were unemployed, so they would take into consideration the man's earnings when setting it. And during the Depression, increasingly, there were more and more cases where judges would say, he can't, and refer him to the WPA or somewhere for a job. So sometimes it was they couldn't, sometimes it was they wouldn't, sometimes they would jump bail right after the court hearing. So there were a lot of different reasons. And I think what's consistent about it is that the women were being told, this is how you're going to make it financially, right? So it's, in some ways, it's the women who are it's meant to discipline men in their behavior, but it disciplines women and it tells them, this is where your support is supposed to come from. Whether it does or not, they're getting taught that lesson. So, yeah.
Right, just another way that you know, that men weren't able to pay is that there's one case that's in the exhibit that has like sort of a final resolution note from the National Desertion Bureau that explains that the man you know, has been working but isn't making enough money because it's slack season and isn't able to find work, but he's trying. You know, I also found at least a few files that had receipts in them, payment receipts to the National Desertion Bureau. The men would, in some cases, the men would actually pay the National Desertion Bureau. And so, you know, some of the files will have a couple of receipts, and then some of them are just full of them.
Yeah, and there was a collection bureau attached to the courts, and women were told to go there, but they could wait in line like 8 or 9 hours. It was just totally overwhelmed. And the National Desertion Bureau really did a service when they offered to collect any money that came in. That was a real service that they did. I also wanted to say that the United Hebrew Charities also helped men who were unemployed or didn't have the means. And I have one example of a man who deserted. The reason given was gambling, and he had gambling addiction. And they set him up with a business by giving him $600 to start a cleaning business. And when it was going down the tubes, they put more money in. Several times they invested money in it. And then eventually he basically took all the equity out of the business and gambled that away. And they bailed him out and set up the business again. And he deserted again. He actually deserted again. And what I found was they really invested in trying to make men be able to support their families, whereas the deserted wife would get like $2 a week, right? Never enough to start a business or maintain a family, but enough just to get by, just not to starve.
Do you want to take one more question, or?
Sure, take one more.
Yeah, and thank you guys for taking the time and all the effort you've put into illuminating such a fascinating institution. When we're thinking about this service, it's so critical, right? Like, this is, I'm sure, happening to a lot of people that aren't just Jewish and that aren't just in New York. Could you talk a little bit about the diversity of institutions providing this service, whether governmental, non-governmental, in places that aren't New York, where there wouldn't be the concentration that we see or saw?
I mean, I found letters and files, you know, addressed to, you know, JCCs in St. Louis. You know, actually, there's the number of different organizations that the National Desertion Bureau was in contact with is phenomenal. And it ranges from court systems to charitable organizations to orphanages to, like, I was amazed. And you know, part of my amazement was the enormous amount of work it took to do all of this. You know, I don't know the size of the staff they had, but, you know, they were dealing with, you know, hundreds, maybe thousands of cases at a time, and, you know, the number of letters that get sent out and, you know, responses and internal, you know, notes. It's this enormous bureaucracy that actually seems pretty functional, you know, seeing as that they were able to find a lot of the men. But the range, you know, the range of organizations that they're in contact with, and, you know, some of them are international. They're, you know, they're Jewish organizations in Buenos Aires or in Warsaw or in Jerusalem. You know, it's really an international organization to a degree.
Yeah, and I don't know if you were asking, were you asking about non-Jews as well? Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I think that all the welfare system, this is a period when the kind of semi-welfare state that the United States has, I won't say welfare state, is getting its beginnings, right? And a lot of the programs that are developed in the teens before the New Deal get absorbed and feed into New Deal legislation, right? And so this is a welfare system for everybody, right, that's getting developed in this time. At the same time, the legal system, the socialized courts, the family court, is developing in this period. They all serve everybody, and charities and private charities that are not Jewish can use these systems as well. So that's going on at the same time. So we have to remember that the Jewish desertion piece is part of a larger movement to socialize the law, to build a welfare system, to build a safety net for poor people that is more like a welfare system. And that affects everyone, and desertion is one piece of that, right? And it becomes part of that larger system of socio-legal system, of the meshing of social work and law.
All right. Thanks to all of you for coming. Oh, do you want to take one more question? Is that your issue?
Another Zoom question.
The Jewish board.
I'm aware of that, yeah. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'd like to thank Professor Annette Igra and Dr. Annie Polland. Also, if you do want to go to see the exhibit, it is on the 3rd floor, and you have to take the elevator at the front of the building, not the rear of the building. And now I'd like to bring up Hannah Moore, who's the Chief Development Officer of the Jewish Board, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Moore. Let's start with just another quick round of applause for our panel. Thank you for such a fantastic event and evening. Also, we want to give a big thanks to Alex Weiser and the whole team here at YIVO who helped mount this exhibit, which we are just so thrilled to be part of this evening. For those of you who may be here who don't know anything about the Jewish Board or have just heard of us for the first time, we are one of the city's most extensive social service and mental health agencies. This year we're celebrating our 150th anniversary, and as we've looked back, we've really learned that the story of the Jewish Board is interwoven with the history of New York City and the arrival and assimilation of the Jewish communities that we're hearing about and that we're learning about. At really every critical moment in our city's history, the Jewish Board had a role to play. Often we were a leader in the field of mental health care, in professional training, and in social service delivery. We talked a lot tonight, or you talked a lot tonight about United Hebrew Charities, one of our predecessor organizations who helped Jewish families pay rent and support children, helped folks who were being neglected, distributed things like clothes and food and coal and fuel for families. And we trace our roots back as well to the National Desertion Bureau. Today, the Jewish Board doesn't exactly track down wayward husbands in the same way, shape, or form. But we do many of the same kinds of things. Like all of our predecessor organizations, we're really on the forefront of meeting the challenges of our times, providing housing for folks who are homeless and struggling with mental illness, helping children, not necessarily the orphans we heard of the 1900s, but the kids in today's foster care systems, and really providing mental health counseling and the kinds of support that people need to live successful and independent lives. We serve over 45,000 people each year here in New York, people of all ages, races, religions, walks, stripes, and colors. And if you have a minute and want to get to know us, do look us up and check us out. On your way out this evening, in particular, I suspect we have a number of history buffs in the room. So let me suggest that you take a look at what we call our family tree, a sort of large visual display that showcases 150 years of helping people here in New York, the many different organizations that came together to represent and to be the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services that we know today. There's a QR code on there that will take you to a website to share stories of some of the people. I mean, we heard so many great ones tonight, but to share some stories to bring to life, what was it like to be helped by one of these organizations? What was it like to be in New York at these pivotal moments in time? So take a moment to go see the exhibit. There's a reception outside as well, and check out the family tree. And thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight.